Hello everyone and welcome to the presentation on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Before I begin this presentation, I would like to say that Queen's University is situated on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people. While I begin this presentation, I would like to just quickly state that the missing and murdered Indigenous women issue is not an Indigenous problem. It is not a problem that we can dismiss or pretend does not exist. This is a Canadian problem. This is a problem that impacts our sisters, our mothers, our friends. People are being hurt and being victimized by this issue, and this is something that impacts all of us. This presentation will seek to share the harsh reality that is that the current vulnerability of Aboriginal women and youth is linked directly to the impacts of colonization, including the residential school system and the social environment that created it. I would like to begin this presentation by outlining two major areas we'll be focusing on. The first one is the justice system, which focuses on factors such as justice, policing, and governance. The second area is the social welfare area, which will focus on factors such as education, healthcare, children, and reconciliation. It is very important when understanding any issue to find the root of the issue and the history of the issue. Governmental control over the lives of Aboriginal people in Canada began in the 1850s with a series of laws and regulations intended to enforce the patriarchy. It also intended to coerce Aboriginal women to conform to the regiments and edicts demanded by local missionaries and Indians agents in present-day Eastern Canada. This process began before Confederation with legislation in Lower Canada that for the first time set out a definition of who was to be considered an Indian, as seen in the report of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. Broadly speaking, the residential school system attempted to eradicate the culture of generations of Aboriginal people, a practice identified in the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People as cultural genocide. This detrimental effect of abuse in residential schools was compounded by a long series of losses that was experienced by students as a result of being removed from their families and communities. There was a loss of culture, language, traditional values, family bonding, life skills, parenting skills, self-respect, and for many, respect for others. Residential schools attendance, particularly when accompanied by physical and sexual abuse, has been linked to the problems of alcoholism, drug abuse, powerlessness, dependency, low self-esteem, suicide, gambling, homelessness, sexual abuse, violence, and as this presentation will argue, the issue of missing and murdered women. Some survivors and/or their descendants have been in conflict with the legal system, including the criminal justice system and the child welfare system. It is very important that I note today that beginning in 1920, it was illegal for parents to keep their children out of residential schools, and most parents were totally unaware that their children were at risk of physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, sexual, cultural, and verbal abuse while attending these institutions. In other words, parents do not have the power to protect their children from residential schools or from the abusive treatment many students in the schools received. In addition, the removal of children from their families alter relationships between everyone and everything. Family bonds normally created as a result of nurturing and loving relationships were not a part of the residential school experience. The loss of language affected the ability of children to communicate with parents and grandparents, and it reduced their access to cultural and spiritual teachings. Aboriginal women whose children and grandchildren attended residential schools were deprived of their traditional roles as mothers, grandmothers, caregivers, nurturers, teachers, and family decision makers. These roles were similarly stolen from the generations of girls who were unable to learn through observation and interaction with their own mothers and grandmothers. The emotional bond between mothers and children was loosened. This disconnection was compounded for women who lost their Indian status and were no longer allowed to live among their people on traditional territories. Near the end of the residential school era, families were subjected to another yet set of discriminatory practices and policies known as the 60s Scoop. As a result of policies of various child welfare systems, large numbers of Aboriginal children were removed from their families and taken into care by child welfare agencies. Many children were put through various adoption processes, mainly with white families. As a result, many of these children, who are now adults, lost connections with their families at birth. It has also resulted in a large residue of distrust and resistance to child welfare institutions. Many women who were forced to leave their home communities and often their children in order to find employment or pursue training or education was caused by the lack of access to education on reserves. In doing so, they also leave behind a big part of their culture as they struggle to fit into a non-Aboriginal work environment. The report also pointed out that Aboriginal people often have lower levels of education than the general population. This would clearly restrict them to lower job wages. Medical services are not often found scattered throughout reserves. Aboriginal health access centers and Aboriginal healthcare organizations lack in numbers in Ontario and across Canada as well. In Canada, Aboriginal women also suffer discrimination on the basis of race, gender, and class within the justice system. The element of systematic racism runs very deep within some police forces. This issue was examined by the Royal Canadian Army Police and numerous provincial justice inquiries and federal task forces, such as the recent event in Ipperwash, Ontario. One of the reasons behind the distrust of police expressed by so many Aboriginal people is the experience of both being over-policed and under-policed. The Royal Canadian Army Police report stated that when compared to non-Aboriginal communities, Aboriginal communities receive proportionally greater law enforcement attention and proportionately less keeping and other services than other communities. Aboriginal people, including Aboriginal women, are vastly overrepresented in federal and provincial jails and have frequently been subject to police violent actions. With the history of colonization and its effects on Aboriginal women, the institutions and systems that exist in Canada are still causing grave human rights abuses. This presentation has outlined some of the underlying factors that impact and influence the lives of Aboriginal women today, including the lives of Aboriginal women who have been murdered or gone missing. A major issue with our justice system is lack of answers from our government that put our Indigenous women in danger. It is also well documented that First Nations people, both on and off reserves, are now amongst the poorest in Canada. Indigenous women living both on and off reserves are amongst the poorest Aboriginal peoples. In Canada, 42.7% of Aboriginal women live in poverty, double the percentage of non-Aboriginal women, and significantly more than the number of Aboriginal men. The average annual income of an Aboriginal woman is $13,300 compared to the $19,350 for a non-Aboriginal woman, as well as being overrepresented among the poor. The economic contributions Aboriginal women do and are often minimized and ignored. These statistics highlight the economic vulnerability of Aboriginal women and children. It was reiterated in a report on Aboriginal women and the economy that Aboriginal people, quote, marginalization within today's economy is tied to their displacement from their land. This displacement destroyed a traditional way of life and undermined Aboriginal people, unquote. Ability to provide for themselves, a right which is guaranteed in international laws such as the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. These statistics are just numbers taken by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Royal Canadian Armed Police, just to look at the numbers of Aboriginal women, just to give you numbers for vulnerability purposes. This video testimony is a short clip which shows a girl hugging her mom and leaving to go to the mall. She quickly vanishes and leaves her friends, family, and close ones behind. This video goes on later to connect with younger people and to encourage them to put their safety first at all times. In closing, it is important that we are able to move forward as a society. We need to know how to be allies, and we need to understand what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. We need to improve the operations of our justice system through written policy, establish goals to identify and close the gaps in our healthcare system and in our policing system. We need better funding and education on and off reserves. Being an ally goes farther than respecting and accepting Indigenous people. We need to care for the earth. We need to question and resist stereotypes. We need to reach out to Indigenous neighbors. We need to learn about the culture, tradition, and the histories of Indigenous people around us. We need to appreciate the diversity of nations, cultures, and people. And we need to stand with our Indigenous and Aboriginal people, women, and girls. In closing, I would just like to re-emphasize some key points. Residential schools have left an enduring impact on Indigenous issues, including missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Social welfare continues to be a problem in many Indigenous communities, often on reserve. Our justice system faces many critical issues in regards to our systematic and policing operations. And it is very important to state, we can still do better.